Hello, my name is Paul Danove, and I am here to walk through the Gospel of Mark with you. I am doing this under the auspices of St. John the Evangelist Parish and through the good graces of Father Tom Betts, our pastor. This is not the original recording of the class. I'm new to the system. I pushed wrong buttons. We had a fun class yesterday and it didn't get recorded. So this class will be a bit shorter than the announced 90 minutes because I took time yesterday to greet each of the participants who showed up, and Father Tom came in and introduced and closed out the course. I also spent time at the end of each verse or two, stopping to ask if there were any questions. And if there were, we discussed them. I won't be able to do that now, but I will try to incorporate all of that information into this recording. I will begin with sharing my screen. Oh, and let me say, it's very nice that you are all here, even if virtually. So let's share the screen. Now, to all participants, those of you who may be present next week, please remind me to push record and the second button I have to push after that at the beginning of each session, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, if I haven't already done so. That hopefully will get you into the original class starting next week. Introductions. What I will do. I will do an exegesis of the text of Mark in this class. Exegesis is the interpretation of the text in its original context. What does that mean? The goal of this class is to try to tease out, as far as we are able, what the writer of the Gospel of Mark was attempting to communicate to his audience. And I say his because in the first century, most people who could read and write were male, but we don't have any signature on this gospel, so who knows? But the interpretation of the text in its original context means that I will have to bring in historical, cultural, and societal norms, beliefs, practices from the first century into our interpretation of the text. And for truth in advertising, I will do so using semantic, narrative, and rhetorical methods of analysis. I study the Gospel of Mark as a story that is trying to communicate a particular theology to its community. I will not bore you or confound you with a lot of semantic, narrative, and rhetorical jargon. In fact, I will try to remove as much of that as possible. I will try to explain the interpretation of each and every verse in this text, and I will attempt to do it in such a way that we piece by piece build up the theological program of the author. And I will just refer to that author as Mark hereafter. Now, what I ask of you is that you be a sympathetic listener reader. I am not asking you to be sympathetic to me. I am asking you to be sympathetic to the text. That sounds a bit odd, so let me explain why. Mark wrote this gospel with a particular set of beliefs about how the world functions. For example, he thought that the world was encased in a firmament or a gigantic lid that was put on the bottom. I don't know what the bottom of what is because Genesis 1 doesn't tell me. But through the first creation account, God arrives at a chaotic place, builds a dome over one part of it, pumps out the chaos, and as a result, from Mark's perspective, if you traveled far enough up or far enough left or right or backwards and forwards, eventually you would come to a hard surface that was keeping the outside chaos out and the inside ordered creation in. Now, we have a very different cosmology today. We think that the Earth revolves around the sun, which revolves around the center of the Milky Way, and on and on and on. But when we read through this gospel, we have to try to listen to it as someone who accepts that the world is covered by a lid. Another example is that there are angelic and demonic or unclean spirits, all kinds of beings mentioned that we may or may not hold to be the case in modern society. We might attribute what Mark attributes to demonic possession to medical or psychological problems. But when we listen to this gospel, we place ourselves in his worldview, in which these are, in fact, the causes of the problems that Jesus will deal with. Secondly, I have to ask you to put aside all information from other New Testament writings, especially the other three Gospels. Why? Well, first of all, as far as we can tell, Mark was the first Gospel to be written down. So there were no other Gospels to reflect on. And as far as we know, Mark was or was not familiar with other writings that had already been written that are not yet that ultimately become part of the New Testament. And that being the case, we can't import any information from other New Testament writings if we are to hear what Mark was trying to communicate to Mark's community. Okay. Next, the composition of Mark. When Mark set about to compose this gospel, what he had were a number of individual, unrelated stories. These stories in general did not have any time signature, so we don't know which day of which year they occurred. They had very few place signatures. Some of them would say when Jesus entered the synagogue, he did this, or when Jesus was in the temple, he said that, or even when Jesus was in the desert or wilderness, this happened. But that's all Mark had to work with. The stories were individual, disjointed, and he had no way of placing them in any kind of order, except for the fact that he knew that Jesus's ministry began after he was baptized. He knew that Jesus died in Jerusalem or was put to death in Jerusalem, and that his resurrection was proclaimed near Jerusalem. But aside from these few facts, he probably didn't know much more about the chronology of Jesus's life. So what did he do? He took the stories and the statements of Jesus and he organized them thematically. Now, what is the purpose of doing this? Why would Mark even begin to write a gospel and to organize information thematically if it had worked pretty well for the previous 30 or 40 years without anybody doing this? Well, the problem Mark and other Christians were facing in the 60s of the first century was that the stories could be told individually, or a statement of Jesus could be told individually. But if there were any disagreement or discussion or confusion about what Jesus did or said, people could turn to an actual eyewitness of the event, because there was still many of these living until the 50s. But starting in the 60s, most of the eyewitnesses to Jesus had either died of natural causes or were put to death for their proclamation. And so he had no one to go to. Most people had no one to go to settle what was the meaning of this action or the meaning of this statement. And so he decided that the way he could help people to interpret the stories were to group together stories with common or similar thematic content. Now, in doing this, he did much more than group stories together. He wanted to create one continuous story of the life of Jesus. So he had to connect these stories with one another. And today we'll see one example of a connective he does to join two distinct stories. He could also add narratorial comments, which he does quite frequently, to guide the interpretation of the audience concerning what the action or the statement of Jesus meant. And we will start to see those next class. Unfortunately, we will only get up to chapter 1, verse 11 today. So we'll have to wait until we get further into the gospel so I can start to show his narratorial comments about this meant this, or this happened because, or what he meant was, that kind of thing. Okay? So he organized these stories according to thematic content, but to give the story a flow, besides adding connectives between the stories, he used the repetition of certain words to link sections together. And these are considered in this course, they're going to be called theological locations. And I will explain what I mean by that. But whenever I say something is a theological place or location or anything else, I mean, it would trigger for the audience who's listening a remembrance of some part or parts of the scriptures, to us, the Old Testament. So he uses these to evoke in us particular stories we're familiar with from the past. Now, he also uses numbers and words that are familiar to the audience. The numbers are completion numbers. The completion numbers we'll deal with in the Gospel of Mark are 3, 7, 12, and 40. Now, sometimes he will mention these numbers specifically, but more important, he will introduce a particular word 3 times in a very short span, this is emphasized. This is the main thing we're talking about. 3 was primarily a Gentile, that is non-Jewish number. 7 was an important number both for Jews and Gentiles. For Jews, 7 was important because, among other things, God created the world in 7 days. For Gentiles, it was important because when students were taught to write Greek and to compose a document, they were encouraged to organize it into preferably an odd number of parts, with 7 being the example. In the schools in Athens, wherever they were in Athens, they could always look up at the Acropolis and see the Temple of Athena, which had 7 distinct facades on the top of the temple, the lintel of the temple. And so they would say, compose this section and then look at the next picture and compose this section. So 7 was important in Greek education and in Jewish thought. 12 is a completion number. Obviously, it's Jewish because there are the 12 tribes of Israel. And we will see several important developments triggered in the gospel by the, believe it or not, 12-fold repetition of a particular word in a given context. So he's using this. And 40 was the only rather unpleasant completion number, because in the scriptures, 40 was not a happy time. If something happened over 40 years, like the Exodus, it was a time of hardship and testing by God to prove their faithfulness to God. 40 days and 40 nights was pretty rough on the whole world, except for Noah and what was in his ark. So 40 can evoke immediately a feeling of dread, of concern, that something difficult, hard, some test of God is looming. Okay? Now, the theological words that Mark uses were key words in the scriptures, the Old Testament, and it would have to do with places or articles of clothing. He even uses one of those in today's lecture, and any other artifact from the scriptures that would be known to his audience and could evoke for them further understanding of what he's trying to say. This might seem strange to us because we are in a visual culture of writing. If Mark were writing a theology book, he could put in footnotes, but he can't do that in a story. He can explain certain things, but frequently all he needs to do is evoke for the audience a certain story or stories from the Old Testament, the scriptures, which use that word a lot. We're going to see, for example, the word way would immediately evoke for any listener familiar with the scriptures the way of the Lord, which is a way of good conduct, but of hardship and things like that. So that's the way he inserted his footnotes into the story. Then when he organized this material, he placed it in a chiastic structure of content. Now, this chiastic structure is from the Greek word he, which is the letter that looks like X in English. And what they did was a chiastic structure is arranged like an arrowhead, which is the latter or right half of the letter he. And this is the way students were taught to write, to arrange their arguments chiastically. In fact, we have the textbooks that students studied from. We have copies of those, and they say this is the way you are supposed to construct your presentation. And it can be any odd number of constituents. For Mark, it is 5. For Luke, it is 7. For Matthew, it is 13. It gets very complicated in Matthew's gospel. So he arranges his information and he enters important theological words or other words that he makes particularly theological through repetition. For example, he takes all the information he had about Jesus before he began his ministry. He places them in chapter 1, verses 1 through 15. He holds that together using the word wilderness, which he repeats 3 times, completion number. And that evokes for the audience a time of preparation and testing. And sure enough, this is the place where Jesus is cast out into the desert and undergoes 40 days of testing. He then groups all of the general teachings about discipleship into chapter 1, verse 16 through chapter 8, 26. He holds this section together by repeating Galilee, which had both theological and practical reminiscences attached to it. First of all, Jesus was from Galilee, so that's where he did most of his preaching and teaching, and that's where he gathered his disciples. So it's a perfect word to cover discipleship. But in the scriptures, the word Galilee also had a somewhat ambiguous interpretation. In fact, Isaiah calls it Galilee of the Gentiles. Why? Because the people from up there, the Jewish people from up there, frequently intermarried with Gentiles. And so for the people down south, where Jerusalem was, they were a bit suspect because they produced prophets. All but one of the minor prophets came from Galilee. They were frequently preaching against what was commonly accepted as the proper observance of Israelite religion. So they were a bit considered troublemakers. And sure enough, that fits Jesus very well too, because he's constantly challenging the status quo in Palestine of his time. Then Mark places together all of the hard teachings about discipleship. We'll call that section C. It's the middle section of the chiastic structure. And since it's dealing with proper behavior and what is expected and required of disciples and what it is, and the difficulties of discipleship, Mark chooses the word way. And sure enough, way shows up 7 times. So that's the way he holds this section together. And then he had stories about Jesus in Jerusalem. So he places those in chapter 11, verse 1 through chapter 15, verse 41. He uses the word Jerusalem to tie this section together, frequently repeated. But what he does is he turns the meaning of this word on its head. Because if you asked any first century Jew about Jerusalem, well, that's where the house of God was. That was the place where true teaching about God came from. That was to be the capital of the restored Israel in the future. It was the place of hope. It was the place of orthodoxy. It was the place of triumph over their enemies. And instead, Mark flips the meaning of this piece by piece by making it a place of failure. It's the failure of the disciples. All of the disciples forsake Jesus in this section. It's the place of the failure of the temple. Jesus clearly lets us know that the temple isn't doing what it's supposed to do. And at least on the surface, it is apparently the place of failure of Jesus because he's convicted and put to death. Although I say apparently because God has other ideas, but from a human perspective, even Jesus seems to fail in Jerusalem. And then he had just a couple of stories about what happened after the death of Jesus. So he placed these in a section, which he ties together by repeating the word tomb. And I'm not going to tell you what the theme of that section is. I'm going to let the students in the class tell me what the theme of that section is when we get there. Now, the interesting thing about a chiastic structure is besides grouping material into thematic organization, it serves a particular didactic and rhetorical function. In other words, it has a teaching function and a persuasive function. Because students in the first century were told that everything you introduce in the A section, the first part of your chiastic structure, gets reformulated and resolved in the A prime section. Very interesting. Everything that's introduced in the B section, the Galilee section, gets resolved in the B prime section. And the C section in the middle is the interpretive key. It tells me why what happened in section A has to become A prime. it tells me why what was introduced in the B section becomes B prime. So let me give you a couple of examples. We'll see many, many examples in the course of our study. In the wilderness section, someone shows up in a very peculiar garment and announces that Jesus is coming. In the tomb section, another character shows up in very peculiar clothing and says that Jesus is coming. Well, if Jesus came in the beginning section, the A section, why does he have to come again? Well, it has something to do with these hard teachings, the first one of which is the Son of Man must suffer much, be rejected, be killed, and rise on the third day. So Jesus was killed in the middle. That's why if we're going to see him, he has to come back at the end. The second teaching basically says, and the same thing may apply to the disciples of Jesus. That's the first teaching in the those are the first two teachings in the way section. Now, at the very beginning of the Galilee section, Jesus begins. He has three occasions in which he calls disciples, and immediately they drop what they're doing and follow him. And Mark is very careful to use a specific verb for leave. They left their nets, they left their father and the workmen in the boat, and in both cases, they followed Jesus. Greek has several different words he could have chosen. But in the Jerusalem section, what happens, Mark is very careful to point out that at the arrest of Jesus, using the same word, they leave him and run away. Why? Because if everything Jesus said in the hinge, the way section, is true, then if Jesus is going to be arrested and convicted and put to death, then they're not up to that challenge. Not yet, at least. They're not up to that challenge yet. So you can see that not only did Mark structure information thematically and put in editorial comments and use completion numbers and theological words, but he also balanced that presentation within the chiastic structure, which is the way they taught students in those times to construct their narratives. And I have included all the answers to the questions that students asked about the chiastic structure. Now, vocabulary. I'm only asking you to remember 3 words, and these are because I've been teaching for more than 35 years, and I've gotten used to saying these without thinking. So I'm going to ask you to learn 3 words and the way I'm going to use them. The first one is pericope, a self-contained narrative unit, usually a paragraph length. A pericope is any story within the complete narrative that you can pull out, and it stays a complete story. This is very easy for us as Catholics to understand because on Sunday, outside of Lent, we usually hear the priest or deacon read a pericope, a short story pulled out of the gospel that is self-contained, and then the homily concerns the content of the pericope. In Lent, the readings can get much longer, and so there'll be several pericopes. The second word I want you to learn is scripture. Now, of course, you know what that means, but I want you to remember it means our Old Testament. Mark will reference this by using the word scripture, graphe, or what has been or was written, gegraptai. There was no New Testament. So remember, whenever we refer to scripture, we're only talking about our Old Testament. And the third word is Septuagint, which is the Latin word for 70. the tradition held that 70 scholars translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and it is the Septuagint is simply the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament. Now, this word is important because the Gospel of Mark, like the entire New Testament, was written in Greek by people who spoke Greek, and it was written for people who understood Greek. And so for most, but not all New Testament writers, they would quote scripture by citing the Greek translation. They wouldn't go through and try to retranslate on their own from the Hebrew, primarily because most of the New Testament was written by people who didn't know Hebrew. They knew the scriptures through Greek. In Matthew's gospel, there are places where he goes back and translates directly, but Matthew obviously knew Hebrew. It's pretty clear that Mark didn't. The only time he translates Hebrew words are words that it's on a few occasions, and they are usually one word or two words. So that would be enough, easy enough for even a Greek speaker to pick up. Okay. Now, I told you about this chiastic structure of the Gospel of Mark. I just want you to see how complicated it is, because yes, the A section is the A section, but it itself is broken into a chiastic structure. The B section is broken into a chiastic structure, and each of its elements is broken into a chiastic structure. And this goes on in the B and B prime sections, in the Galilee and Jerusalem sections. This goes on for 17 levels. That's how carefully structured this gospel is. And I just want you to see this. Please don't take any notes. I'll only remind you. Remember back when Jesus said this? Well, this is the answer. Remember back in chapter 3 when Jesus asked the question. Here's the answer in chapter 14. So how did Mark do this so carefully? Well, before we go on, let me just say this. Mark gives every indication of having been performed orally for a long, long time before it was written down. How do we know this? Well, I will point out various indications that it was originally performed by one person. It wouldn't be like in a theater. It would be a one-man performance of the text. There are numerous places where audiences would react. Audiences were very reactive in the first century, sort of like when I go to movies in the city of Philadelphia, where I live, the audience will shout things at the screen sometimes. That was the way first century audiences were, very reactive. And sometimes Jesus will do something so wonderful, and the response would be to knock if you approve. But Mark's trying to tell a story. So what he'll do is he'll start talking and then repeat the exact same meaning in a different way, he'd start talking, which would quiet down the audience, and then he'd repeat what he had just said in a different way. For example, he said, when it grew dark, when the sun set. Well, those are basically the same meaning, but the first one would tell people it's time to quiet down, and then when it grew dark, we'll tell people, or when the sun set would tell people, okay, we're back in the story. There's also a stage direction in chapter 13, where the writer of the gospel says, let the reader understand. In other words, emphasize this. So there are several indications that this was a performative piece. And since it was probably performed for quite a while before it was written, because writing was so terribly expensive in the first century, paper was expensive, ink was expensive, and you had to have somebody who actually knew how to write and pay them to do it. So over many performances, Mark was able to generate in his mind this very complex structure to help him remember the whole thing. Excuse me. I drink a lot of tea to get me over the rough spots. Okay, so there is your introduction to the Gospel of Mark. And now we're going to move directly to the course. And to do that, I will need to share with you a screen. And here are the first 3 verses of the Gospel of Mark. Now, let me say this in advance. I'm going to spend an inordinately long time on the first 15 verses. Why? Because they are the introduction to the Gospel. And if any of you are familiar with music, every opera, every symphony starts off with an overture where you hear the major themes that are going to be repeated time and time again inside of the opera or the symphony. Well, Mark introduces his major themes here, so we have to go slowly and carefully to pick up as many of these themes as possible before he starts to develop them in the gospel. So we will only get through the first 10 verses, to be exact, today, but we're going to get a lot of theological information out of these verses. And then once we hit chapter 1, verse 16, we'll be doing a little bit more than, on average, than 1 chapter per session. So things will pick up very quickly, but we've got to do the first 15 verses with exquisite care. Now, I am going to read to you the first sentence of the Gospel of Mark. And I want you to listen to it. Arche tu evangeliu Jesu Christu huiu theu kathos gegratai en to Esaia to prophete. Edu apostello ton angelonmu pro prosopusu hoskataskelase tein hodonsu. Phone baontos ente aremo hetoimasete tein hodon kuriu Eltheas poiete tas tribus autu. Now, when I asked the students what was their impression of hearing this sentence, the first thing somebody said was, there's a lot of oo sounds and o sounds, and that's correct. In Greek, about 55% of vowels are long by nature or by location. But in this section, 87% or 88, depending on how you divide it up, percent of the words are vowels are long. So this sentence takes a long time to pronounce. And the second thing students said, well, this sort of slows things down and makes it solemn. And that's exactly what it's designed to do as far as auditory information goes. It's like when we start Mass, the priest doesn't jog to the altar, the priest walks solemnly to the altar. It sets the audience in the proper mood for what's about to happen later. So those were the observations from the class, and they were both right on target. Now, let's go through this sentence very carefully. And I say that this is a sentence. In your translation on the right, it's listed as 3 distinct sentences. Well, that's fine and dandy, but the Greek text actually has no punctuation in it. And I have written extensively on taking this as a single sentence, and lots of people also propose this, and I think it makes the most sense. So it starts off, the first verse is, beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Now, This is somewhat awkward grammar. And as we're going to find out in this class, awkward grammar frequently has a theological pinning. The first word is concrete. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, I even said the out of habit. It's a concrete moment in time and space. But it's missing the article in front of it. So that's kind of odd. But anybody familiar with the scriptures will immediately have bells ringing in their head, because in the scriptures, there is a place, and a very important place, where the word beginning does not appear with the article. And as members of the class noted right away, well, it's from Genesis 1:1. So Mark evokes for his listeners, oh, we're in Genesis 1:1 territory, creation. Beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Now, the Greek here is ambiguous, or I should say polysemous, which just means it has multiple interpretations. In this case, it has two. And the two interpretations also work the same way in English. So I'm going to give you an example. Rome's defeat was glorious. Well, lacking any further information, we don't know if it was Mark's defeat of some other, Rome's defeat of some other country, or if it means, and for example, it would be Rome's defeat of the Carthaginians. So in that case, Rome is the one defeating. The other one would be Rome's defeat by the Parthians. In that case, Rome is the one being defeated. Well, the same ambiguity is here, because this can be interpreted two ways in Greek. It can be the gospel of Jesus Christ, the one he brought and taught, or it can be the gospel of and about Jesus Christ. And Mark uses this ambiguity to make a dual theological point. Yes, the gospel you're about to hear is from Jesus, but it's also about Jesus. So Mark uses the resources of the Greek language to make points. And in an oral culture where almost all information is communicated by speech and hearing, this kind of wordplay is very attractive. People prided themselves on being able to do this, and people enjoyed hearing stuff like this. We have to remember that the basic form of entertainment in the first century among Greek speakers is you would go to the agora in Greek. You'd go to the marketplace, and someone there would start reciting the Iliad or the Odyssey, and you would just listen to the beauty of the words and the play of words, and people would really enjoy that. So they loved wordplay and ambiguities or polysemous occurrences like this. In fact, Jesus is going to use these in his own teaching. So we had an evocation of the beginning of the scriptures, and it's the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Just as it was written in Isaiah the prophet, "Look, I send my messenger before my face, who will prepare your way." Now, this is a bit clunky for a number of reasons. The first reason is this quote actually doesn't come from Isaiah the prophet. It comes from the prophet Malachi. Now, don't worry, Mark's going to save himself, because when we get to verse 3, he will quote Isaiah, but he inserts at the beginning of the Isaiah quote a quote from chapter 3, verse 1 of Malachi. And if we go over here, we will see that chapter 3, verse 1 of Malachi starts off just like that quote. It says, "Look, I am sending my messenger, and he will prepare the way before my face." So the words are arranged in a different order, but this is the quote. There's no other place where this exact set of words comes together. Now, what is he doing here? Well, he's doing so many things that it's going to take me a few minutes to go through. First of all, chapter 3, verse 1 of Malachi is the first verse in the last chapter of the Septuagint. So what has he done so far in the sentence? He has referenced the beginning of scriptures and the end of scriptures. What does that do? He's got the backing of the whole of scriptures behind what he's about to develop for us. And this is the last chapter of the Septuagint because, let me get to it, at the end of the end of the chapter, this sentence is repeated. "Look, I am sending to you Isaiah the Tishbite before the day of the Lord, the great and terrible one, comes." This is why this is the last chapter of the Septuagint, because it references the end of the world. So we start with creation and we finish with the end of the world. And so what God is saying through the prophet Malachi in chapter 3 is that before the end of the world, God is going to send Elijah the prophet, and in the meantime, he says it's to prepare the people for the end. And then the world will end, judgment will occur, and it's all over. And when the New Testament books were put in their present order, the council that did that did the exact same thing. We start off with the Gospels, which are the beginning of Jesus's career, and we end with Revelation, which is the end of the world. So this is, the New Testament is patterned on the order in the Septuagint, even though, as you can see over here in English, some monks during the Middle Ages decided to break off part of chapter 3 and make it chapter 4. So in English, it's listed as chapter 4, but in the Septuagint, it was originally chapter 3, the end of chapter 3, because you can see chapter 3 ends right there, and then you go into something else. Okay, so let's go back to this statement. When God made the statement, it was, "Look, I'm sending my messenger before my face." When Mark reproduces the scripture quote, he says, "Look, I am sending my messenger before your face." So according to the prophet Malachi, God intends to send Elijah the Tishbite before the face of God. But from the Christian perspective, God sends a different messenger before the face of Jesus. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. One of the students asked, well, isn't this changing the text? Well, yes, it is, but all you have to do is read the scriptures themselves. A prophet would make a prophecy, and then when it came through, they would recount the prophecy, making it fit exactly to what actually happened. So this is not anything new in scripture. We were waiting for God to show up we were waiting for Elijah to show up before God did. And what we ended up getting was a different messenger for Christians, John the Baptist, before Jesus did. So the prophecy was correct. It just missed a few important details from a Christian perspective. And like I said, this was done every Sabbath in a synagogue where the scriptures would be read. And then when they were in Hebrew, and when they were translated into Aramaic, which is what the people actually spoke, they would fix them to match exactly what happened. So we all love Malachi, but he was a little bit off. Okay? But there's a deeper thing going on here, because people would remember the original quote. It's at the end of the scriptures, it's important. And what this tells us is that what we expected of God can easily or directly be affected by Jesus. And that's an important theological assertion. And it's going to go on and on and on. Jesus is going to use titles that are reserved to God. Jesus is going to do things that are reserved to God. Jesus is going to say things claiming God's authority, which nobody else would actually do except one of the scriptural prophets. So he's making an important theological point. A voice crying, oh, and who is this messenger? Angelos in Greek, which we translate in English as angel sometimes, but all angelos was in Greek was a messenger, and it could either be a heavenly messenger or a human messenger. Here it's going to be a human messenger, because Elijah was a human. But in this gospel, the messenger is going to be John the Baptist, as we will find out in verses 4-9. A voice of one, now we're into Isaiah, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness. Notice wilderness, desert, is being repeated in the wilderness section, the A section. Prepare the way of the Lord. Greek is cute, straight make straight his paths. Now again, people would be familiar with this. This is an oft quoted statement from Isaiah. And once again, make straight the way of the Lord. Who is the Lord in Isaiah? God. Who is the Lord in Mark's gospel? Jesus. Make straight his paths. His is God in Isaiah. His is Jesus in Mark's gospel. So we give Jesus here the title Son of God. The face of Jesus is going to be our ability to see the face of God in this gospel. The way of Jesus is the way of God. The way of God, the paths of God are the paths of Jesus. So there's a lot of heavy-duty theological work going on in that opening sentence. And then we talked a little bit more about that, but I don't remember what we said. Sorry. But I think I captured all of the important things. So then we get into the actual story, and it starts off with a genita, which is the first example of 4 consecutive short syllables. So we're off, and we're going to take off. This gospel moves. Mark uses the word immediately 32 times in this gospel. One thing happens immediately after the other, immediately after the other. Remember that. In fact, if you count up, and sometimes it's ambiguous, but if you count up the days from when Jesus first enters and begins his ministry to the time of his death, it's either 5 or 7 weeks in the Gospel of Mark. Everything happens immediately. It's a fast-paced, exciting story to listen to, especially if you've got an expressive performer or reader presenting it. John the Baptizing One came to be in the desert and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Now, what did I say? Okay, that's right. So he's proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. The first thing we have to do is take this word repentance. Repentance in English isn't the perfect word to translate this. Unfortunately, we really don't have a perfect word to translate this. The Greek word metanoia means to change your mindset. You've got to change the way you look at things before you can confess your sins. First of all, you've got to recognize that they are sins. Remember, John is going to be talking, and they came out to him, all of Judea and the Jerusalemites, all of them. These are people who are serious religious people. And he's telling them, you actually have to go through a change of mindset before you can realize what your sins are, because all of you presumably are trying to do the right thing, but if you don't know what God expects of you, you can slip into doing what is opposed to God. So this word is extremely important in the Gospel of Mark. Extremely important. You have to change the way you look at things. What you think is, in fact, the truth is not, in fact, the truth. What you think, in fact, is God's expectation of you is not, in fact, God's expectation of you. Jesus is coming to proclaim something new and different, and everything is going to have to be reevaluated in the light of what Jesus says and does. Okay, so notice when John's proclaiming this baptism, it really isn't his baptism. It's the baptism that Jesus is going to make possible for the true forgiveness of sins. And he makes this clear further on. So all of the Jerusalemites and the Judeans for territory in the Jerusalemites were coming out to him and being baptized by him into the Jordan River, confessing their sins. That's pretty straightforward. And John was dressed in the hair of a camel and a hide belt around his waist. Now, as soon as Mark says that, that will ring bells. Because even though Isaiah is the most quoted prophet among Christians, Elijah is considered to be the greatest prophet among Christians. And, oh, can I find it? Let's see. Yes, there's only one place where this exact expression, a leather belt tied around his waist, comes up in the scriptures, and it references the peculiar, and it's referenced because it is peculiar, the peculiar garb of Elijah the prophet. So notice, we were expecting Elijah the prophet to show up according to Malachi. So how does Mark confirm this for us in case we missed it? Yeah, John the Baptist did show up, and he was wearing Elijah's clothes. So he's obviously here to do what Elijah said. That's in 2 Kings 1:8, chapter 1, verse 8. And again, this would be an often enough quoted scripture quote that probably his audience would pick this up. And if they didn't, they already knew from the beginning that John the Baptist came before Jesus, but it just adds depth to it. Yeah, we were expecting John the Baptist, and we were expecting Elijah the prophet, and sure enough, John the Baptist showed up dressed in his garments and did what he was supposed to do, prepare the way of the Lord. and he was eating locusts and honey of the field. Okay. So he's basically eating what people did at times in the desert. So he's evoking all kinds of connections here. And he proclaimed, saying, after me comes one of whom I am not worthy, stooping down to untie the straps of his sandals. Now, this is important because untying the straps of sandals was considered to be one of the most demeaning jobs of students. When the students would sit on the ground and the teacher would walk around and lecture, and then when the teacher got tired, he would sit down, and it was the responsibility of the least of the students to go and undo his sandal straps to help his feet out. So Mark is casting Jesus as the teacher and John as not even being worthy to be among the least of his students. I baptize you by means of water, but he will baptize you by means of Holy Spirit. Notice John's baptism is surface only. You get water on you. That's why I said he was proclaiming a coming baptism of Jesus, because the baptism of Jesus is by Holy Spirit, which is cleansing that goes through and through instead of just on the surface. And it happened in those days. Here's a weak connective. He's joining one story about John the Baptist with another one about Jesus and John the Baptist. And it happened in those days. Notice that this is a pretty weak connective, but it does connect. And because it's weak, because we don't even know which days he was talking about to begin with, but it's around that time. The original story that Mark had would have probably been Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee. That would have been one of the isolated stories, but he connects it with it happened in those days. Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized into the Jordan by John. Now, there are two things going on here. One should be screaming at you, and the other one is quite subtle. All the other people were baptized in the Jordan by John, where the Jordan is the location where this is happening, whereas Jesus is baptized into. And it's a very slight distinction in Greek, but it's an important distinction because in the former interpretation, to be baptized in the, and baptized means dunk or dip. So he put his hand on the head and dunk them down and they'd come up. He's actually acting on the people being baptized and they're being affected by that, not with forgiveness of sins, but with becoming wet. But in Greek, if you baptize someone into it, it emphasizes only the motion, not the fact that you end up getting wet, but he's moving Jesus. The important thing, excuse me, I have asthma and it's cold and I was out in the cold, so I'm coughing. The important thing is this: if John is proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, and Jesus himself gets baptized, what's going on? I mean, in the other Gospels, which were written after Mark and used Mark in whole or in part as a basis for their outline, Matthew completely reworks this because he has John the Baptist say, oh, you should be baptizing me. And Luke finds this rather embarrassing and has Jesus baptized, but not by John the Baptist. And in John's gospel, Jesus never gets baptized. Because if Jesus is being baptized by John, there's the implication that he needs either repentance or the forgiveness of sins. And we all know Jesus does not need the forgiveness of sins. So what is Mark doing here? Excuse me. Well, in this gospel, believe it or not, Jesus undergoes major and minor metanoias. How do I phrase that? Mark presents Jesus as growing into his ministry. All other gospels present Jesus as a finished work when he begins. But Mark loves to emphasize the human characteristics of Jesus. Yes, he's the Son of God, he's divine. But he really hammers hard on the human characteristics of Jesus. So Jesus will come into situations where he has to change his understanding of what's going on. What's the value of this? Well, we certainly know the divinity of Jesus. He's Jesus Christ, Son of God. But Mark wants to emphasize this because his community is not a finished work. And if it's okay for Jesus to grow into his ministry, it's okay for them to grow into their ministries. So for Mark, there's no contradiction here. Jesus certainly does not need forgiveness of sins. Throw that away. But Jesus is going to be shown to develop in his ministry. And I'll point out examples of this. Most of them are minor, but one of them is pretty big. And immediately coming out of the water, he saw the heavens being rent and the Spirit like a dove coming down onto him. And this is where we ended the last class. Now, what's important about this? Well, in Mark's gospel, he goes far out of his way to say that only Jesus sees this happen. So none of the other people there are attributed with being able to see this. And we'll discuss more what implications that has for the development of the gospel when we get into it. But for the moment, only Jesus can see this. It's not like the gospels where other people can see it. He sees the heavens being torn. The Greek word is schizo. It sounds like tearing cloth. It's a violent word. And in the scriptures, only one person is attributed with the capacity to tear the heavens or the sky. And that is God, because if God made the heavens, God can tear the heavens. But using this violent, in fact, one of the prophets says to God, when are you going to tear the heavens and bring all things to good? Because people are yearning for this in hard times. But there's a profound theological consequence of this. If you remember, and I'm going to have to go back since we've finished with this, I'm going to have to go back to our visual. And this is, I'm a lousy artist, but here's our visual. There's chaos on the outside of the dome, the firmament. And God removed, at first creation account, chapter 1, God removes the chaos from inside of the dome so that dry land can appear. And then God places human beings, plants, and animals on the earth and birds in the sky. Got some birds flying up there. And then the angels or heavenly beings are at the top. What happens if you tear this lid? Chaos comes tumbling down. Chaos comes tumbling down. And what happens when the chaos hits the dry land? Everything is destroyed. It's the end. So just like in Malachi, when God said God would send Elijah before God's face to prepare the people for the great and terrible day of the Lord, Judgment Day, the end of the end of the world from Mark's perspective technically begins the day Jesus is baptized. And now we can see why he presents the ministry of Jesus in 5 to 7 weeks, why he's always doing things immediately. Mark believes that the end is near, not tomorrow, but near enough. And his point is the end has already begun. We live in eschatological times. You may have heard that expression. In Greek, eschaton means end. Eschaton is the end. And by end, they mean the end. The baptism of Jesus initiates eschatological times. So just like Elijah the Tishbite, the prophet, was to signal that the end was near, John the Baptist, in introducing Jesus, also introduced the end of the world being near. We live in eschatological times. We don't have time to fool around. We are going to have to learn what Jesus and God expect of us. We're going to have to put that into effect as soon as possible. To do that, we are going to have to undergo metanoia in Greek or metanoia in English. We're going to have to change the way we think about things. We're going to have to see things from Jesus and God's point of view. We're going to have to reform our lives, and we're going to have to become the people that God expects us to be. And that is the consequence of the tearing of the sky. And that is going to be worked out throughout the entire Gospel of Mark. The time is at hand. Repent. Change your mindset. Believe the gospel. Listen to the new teaching of Jesus, which either reinterprets or overturns much of what you think is true. Learn from the actions and teachings of Jesus and prepare yourself for the end. Okay, so I hope I do this right next week. I hope that you get to see the class ask questions and answer questions. And I look forward to meeting you all someday, even if it's only in the virtual world of Zoom. If you didn't make class and you can make class, be aware that I start the recording 15 minutes before class, so at 6:45 Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to come in if you have questions and ask them, and I will try to address them. I can also hear your voice. I don't see very well, as you will learn in this course. I'm seeing impaired, so I have to be very close to the screen, and I can't see those little faces that are there, even magnified in my huge screen. But hopefully, I will learn the sounds of the voices of at least those of you who ask questions. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.